Case 1. Alex Murdaugh. The jury took less than 3 hours. On March 2nd, 2023, after 6 weeks of testimony and 70 witnesses, 12 jurors filed back into a Colleton County courtroom and found Richard Alexander Murdaugh guilty on all counts, 2 murders, 2 weapons charges, and in doing so brought a century of legal dynasty crashing down in the very building where that dynasty had once wielded absolute power. His grandfather's portrait had been removed from the walls before trial, a quiet institutional acknowledgement that the family's era of influence had already ended. What remained was simply the formality of justice catching up. Richard Alexander Murdaugh was born in 1968 into what South Carolina Low-Country residents called legal royalty. His family had held the elected 14th Circuit Solicitor position for 87 consecutive years across 3 generations, giving the Murdaughs unparalleled control over criminal prosecutions in Hampton County and the surrounding region. By the time Alex reached middle age, he was a partner at Peters, Murdaugh, Parker, Eltsroth, and Dietrich, one of the most prominent personal injury firms in the state, practicing civil litigation and building a reputation as a courtroom presence who commanded attention and respect. He had attended the University of South Carolina and its law school, married Margaret Brandstetter, and raised 2 sons, Paul and Buster, on the sprawling family estate known as Moselle. From the outside, the Murdaughs appeared untouchable, wealthy, connected, powerful. What no one saw was the decades-long opioid addiction Alex had concealed, the mounting financial desperation as he stole millions from clients and his own law firm to feed that addiction, and the civil litigation that was about to expose everything he had spent years hiding. The 2 people Alex Murdaugh was convicted of killing were not strangers or clients. They were his own family. Margaret Murdaugh, known as Maggie, was 52 years old, his wife of 27 years, a devoted mother and homemaker, active in low-country social circles, and known for her warmth and hospitality at family gatherings on the Moselle property. Paul Murdaugh was 22, the younger of their 2 sons, a University of South Carolina student described by friends as outgoing but troubled by the weight of his own legal crisis. In February 2019, Paul had been driving the family boat while intoxicated when it crashed, killing 19-year-old Mallory Beach and sparking 3 felony charges against him. The Beach family's aggressive wrongful death lawsuit was pushing toward discovery that would force the Murdaughs to disclose their financial records, and those records would reveal the truth Alex had fought for years to conceal. Maggie trusted her husband completely and came to Moselle on the night of June 7th, 2021, because he had asked her to. Paul, despite his own troubles, never imagined his father would harm him. The profound betrayal that followed was that they were murdered by the person who should have protected them above all others. On the morning of June 7th, 2021, Alex was confronted at the law firm about missing fees, the pressure tightening around the financial crimes he had committed for over a decade. That evening, he called both Maggie and Paul to come to the 1,700-acre Moselle estate. Around 8:44 that night, Maggie and Paul were near the dog kennels, and Paul was recording a cell phone video of one of the dogs when the camera captured something neither of them registered in the moment. Alex's voice, clearly audible, placing him at the kennels. That detail would become the thread that unraveled his entire defense. Approximately 5 minutes later, at 8:49 or 8:50, the murders occurred. Paul was shot twice with a 12-gauge shotgun, once in the chest and once in the head and shoulder area as he fell. Maggie was shot 4 or 5 times with a .300 blackout rifle as she tried to run, the shots fired at close range with overwhelming force. Both weapons were family-owned and kept on the property. Within minutes, Alex had returned to the main house, and by 9:07, he was driving to visit his ailing mother in nearby Almeda, a trip that lasted approximately 20 minutes and served to establish an alibi. He returned to Moselle around 10 that evening, walked to the kennels, and at 10:07 called 911, his voice breaking as he reported that he had found Maggie and Paul shot to death. When Colleton County deputies arrived minutes later, they found Alex standing near two bodies in the dim light by the kennels. The South Carolina Law Enforcement Division took over the investigation immediately, and in the hours and days that followed, Alex was publicly portrayed as a devastated husband and father, grieving an unimaginable loss. What investigators quietly began assembling over the following 13 months was a minute-by-minute reconstruction of that evening, using cell phone location data, step counts, vehicle telematics from onboard computers, and the breakthrough piece of evidence, Paul's cell phone video capturing Alex's voice at the kennels at 8:44, directly contradicting his claim that he had been at the house napping and had never gone to the kennels that night. The timeline prosecutors developed made his alibi impossible. Ballistics confirmed that shell casings at the scene came from family weapons, though the guns themselves were never recovered and are believed to have been disposed of in swamps or rivers near the property. As SLED built the murder case, investigators simultaneously reopened the suspicious 2018 death of the family's housekeeper, Gloria Satterfield, who had died in a fall at Moselle under circumstances that were never scrutinized because of the family's influence. Alex had arranged a $4.3 million wrongful death settlement for Satterfield's sons, but had stolen every dollar, and they had never seen a cent. A pattern emerged across multiple cases. Alex Murdaugh at the center of deaths, deception, and theft, protected for years by a family name that had made him untouchable. On July 14, 2022, more than a year after the murders, a grand jury indicted Alex on 2 counts of murder and 2 counts of possession of a weapon during the commission of a violent crime. By then, he was already incarcerated on separate fraud charges. Prosecutors from the South Carolina Attorney General's office announced they would not seek the death penalty, but would pursue life imprisonment. Alex, represented by defense attorneys Dick Harpootlian and Jim Griffin, pleaded not guilty. Trial began in January 2023 at the Colleton County Courthouse in Walterboro before Judge Clifton Newman with a sequestered jury, hearing evidence for 6 weeks. Lead prosecutor Creighton Waters argued that Alex had executed his wife and son to create a massive tragedy that would generate sympathy, delay the civil litigation threatening to expose his financial crimes, and buy him time to continue covering his tracks. The prosecution's case was built on circumstantial evidence, cell phone data, car telemetry, the use of 2 different family weapons suggesting planning rather than impulse, and Alex's own shifting stories and admitted lies. The defense attacked the investigation as sloppy, argued that police had fixated on Alex while ignoring other potential suspects, and emphasized that no murder weapons had been found and no blood spatter or gunshot residue definitively tied him to the shootings. Alex took the stand in his own defense, admitting to decades of stealing from clients and lying about being at the kennels that night, blaming opioid-induced paranoia for the deception, but insisting repeatedly that he would never hurt Maggie or Paul. The jury did not believe him. On March 2nd, 2023, after deliberating less than 3 hours, they returned guilty verdicts on all counts. The following day, Alex Murdaugh returned to Judge Newman's courtroom for sentencing. Newman imposed 2 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole, the mandatory punishment under South Carolina law, and spoke for nearly 20 minutes about the profound betrayal Alex had committed. Quote, _0__. Newman said, quoting Sir Walter Scott, before calling Alex someone who had deceived and lied throughout his life and become a monster when fueled by greed and drugs. The judge noted the family's century of prosecutorial power and emphasized the duplicitous conduct Alex had displayed, even on the witness stand. Alex again proclaimed his innocence, his voice breaking as he insisted he was wrongly convicted and would never have hurt his wife or son. No family members offered victim impact statements, Maggie's sister and other relatives had attended trial daily, but declined to speak at sentencing, and Buster Murdaugh, the surviving son, sat stoically and did not address the court. The defense immediately filed an appeal, and in September 2023 sought a new trial, alleging that the Colleton County Clerk of Court had improperly influenced jurors during trial. An evidentiary hearing was held in January 2024, but Judge Jean Toll denied the motion, finding the defense had failed to prove the verdict was affected. Separately, Alex pleaded guilty in November 2023 to 22 state financial crime counts and received a 27-year sentence, and in April 2023 pleaded guilty to 22 federal counts, receiving 40 years to run concurrently. The combined sentences ensure he will remain incarcerated even if the murder convictions were somehow overturned. The courtroom where 3 generations of Murdaughs had prosecuted criminals witnessed Alex's conviction for murdering his own family, and the dynasty that had controlled South Carolina Lowcountry justice for nearly a century ended not with honors or retirement, but in handcuffs and disgrace. The case obliterated the family's legal empire and forced reviews of multiple suspicious deaths and systemic failures that had allowed a powerful attorney to steal, deceive, and kill unchecked for years. Mallory Beach's family, pursuing justice for their daughter killed in Paul's boat crash, inadvertently set everything in motion. Their civil lawsuit forced the financial discovery that Alex murdered to prevent. Maggie and Paul Murdaugh deserved better than execution at the hands of the man who should have protected them. They trusted him. He called them to that estate on a June evening, and the dynasty built on justice ended in its ultimate betrayal. Case 2. Thomas Capano. A large cooler floated in the Atlantic Ocean 60 miles off the New Jersey coast, riddled with bullet holes, drifting on the current until a commercial fisherman spotted it and hauled it aboard. Inside that cooler, investigators would later determine, had been the body of a woman who disappeared from Wilmington, Delaware, on a June night in 1996. A woman whose last known companion was one of the most powerful attorneys in the state. The cooler became the centerpiece of a trial that exposed not just a murder, but the willingness of a politically connected lawyer to use his family, his influence, and every resource at his disposal to conceal what he had done. Thomas Joseph Capano was born October 11th, 1949, into one of Wilmington's wealthiest and most prominent families. His father had built a construction and real estate empire that made the Capano name synonymous with power and influence across Delaware. Thomas attended law school and rose through the state's political circles, serving as Deputy Attorney General and later as counsel to Governor Mike Castle in the early 1990s. By the mid-90s, he was a managing partner at a major regional law firm and a Democratic power broker whose connections reached the highest levels of state government. He was married with 4 daughters, living a life of public respectability. What colleagues and constituents did not see was the web of extramarital affairs Capano maintained with state officials and colleagues, relationships he controlled through manipulation, jealousy, and rage that witnesses would later describe as escalating and dangerous. Anne Marie Fahey was 30 years old in June 1996, serving as scheduling secretary to Delaware Governor Thomas Carper, and well-liked in political circles for her work ethic and warm personality. She came from a large Irish Catholic family in Wilmington and was close to her siblings, though she struggled with low self-esteem and an eating disorder that made her emotionally vulnerable in relationships. For 3 years, she had been involved in a secret on and off affair with Capano, who was 17 years older and married. By the spring of 1996, Fahey was trying to end the relationship and see other men, a reality that prosecutors would argue enraged Capano and triggered the obsessive jealousy that led to her death. Her diary contained an entry describing him as a quote one, words that would become powerful evidence of motive when the case finally reached trial. On the evening of June 27th, 1996, Capano took Fahey to dinner at Panorama, a Philadelphia restaurant, ostensibly to discuss their relationship. They left around 9, and Capano later claimed he briefly took her to his rented house on Grant Avenue in Wilmington to give her groceries and a gift before driving her home. She was never seen alive again. Prosecutors alleged that at the Grant Avenue house that night, Capano shot and killed Fahey, likely using a .22 caliber Beretta pistol that his longtime mistress, Deborah McIntyre, had obtained for him weeks earlier. He then placed her body into a large Igloo marine cooler he had purchased in advance, cleaned the scene meticulously, and delivered her groceries to her apartment to bolster the fiction that he had dropped her off safely. The following morning, June 28th, he enlisted his brother Gerard to help take the cooler on Gerard's boat out of Stone Harbor, New Jersey, approximately 60 to 70 miles offshore into the Atlantic, where they dumped the weighted cooler containing Fahey's body into deep water. Believing the ocean would erase all evidence of the crime, Fahey's family reported her missing on June 30th, 1996, after she failed to appear for a family gathering and missed work without explanation. Wilmington police and the FBI launched an extensive investigation, focusing quickly on Capano as the last person known to have seen her. Searches of Fahey's apartment and Capano's Grant Avenue home eventually turned up 2 small bloodstains matching Fahey's DNA profile. An FBI analyst testified the chance of another white American having the same profile at those loci was approximately 1 in 11,000. Investigators also learned that Capano had bought a large cooler weeks before the disappearance, and that when Gerard later sold his boat, its 2 anchors were missing. The fisherman's recovery of a bullet-riddled cooler floating at sea became the breakthrough. Receipts and testimony traced it back to Capano's purchase, and prosecutors argued he had shot the cooler when it refused to sink properly with Fahey's body inside. Under mounting pressure, Gerard and another brother, Louis, eventually cooperated with authorities, telling investigators they had helped dispose of a body at sea and had junked a blood-stained couch from Capano's home. The web of family complicity began unraveling as the evidence accumulated. On November 12, 1997, approximately 17 months after Fahey's disappearance, Delaware authorities arrested Thomas Capano and charged him with first-degree murder. The indictment alleged he had intentionally killed Fahey and disposed of her body to conceal the crime, and prosecutors elected to pursue the death penalty. He pleaded not guilty, represented by an experienced defense team including Joseph O'Terry and Eugene Moorer, while the Delaware Attorney General's office, with Ferris Wharton leading the prosecution, prepared a circumstantial case built on DNA evidence, financial and phone records, witness testimony about Capano's affairs, Gerard's account of the ocean disposal, and the recovered bullet-riddled cooler. Trial opened on October 26, 1998, in Delaware Superior Court before Judge William Swain Lee, and lasted approximately 3 months. Prosecutors argued that Capano, a spurned lover unable to accept that Fahey was ending the relationship, had planned her murder for months, acquiring the Beretta and the cooler, and luring her to his house after dinner to kill her when she refused to continue the affair. The defense admitted for the first time at trial that Fahey had died in Capano's home, but spun an alternative narrative, that McIntyre had unexpectedly arrived, drawn the pistol in a jealous rage, and accidentally shot Fahey during a struggle, after which Capano panicked and covered up the death. They sought to shift blame to McIntyre, pointing out that she testified under an immunity deal after earlier perjury. Capano himself took the stand, admitting he helped dump Fahey's body at sea and lied to investigators, but insisting her death was an accident caused by McIntyre. The jury rejected this account entirely. On January 17, 1999, they found him guilty of first-degree murder. On March 16, 1999, Judge Lee followed a non-unanimous jury recommendation of 11-1 for death and sentenced Capano to death by lethal injection, calling him an _quote_2__. The sentence automatically went to appellate review, as required in Delaware capital cases. In 2006, the Delaware Supreme Court affirmed his conviction, but vacated the death sentence because it had been imposed by a judge following a non-unanimous jury recommendation, a procedure that violated evolving United States Supreme Court precedent, requiring greater jury involvement in capital sentencing. Rather than retry the penalty phase, prosecutors agreed to a sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole. Capano pursued state and federal appeals, challenging the sufficiency of evidence, the admission of various testimony, and alleged constitutional errors. But the Delaware Supreme Court and federal courts rejected his challenges, and his life sentence remained intact. Thomas Capano died in prison on September 19, 2011, at age 61, at the James T. Vaughn Correctional Center near Smyrna, Delaware. Authorities reported he likely died of natural causes while serving his life sentence, and no foul play was suspected. The case became one of Delaware's most notorious murders, spawning multiple books and a television miniseries, and highlighting intimate partner violence in professional circles. Anne Marie Fahey's family and friends have continued to memorialize her as a victim of coercive control and emotional abuse turned lethal, and her case is often cited in discussions of stalking and domestic violence risk factors among high-status professionals. The most chilling detail remains Gerard's account of helping his brother dump a chained cooler into the Atlantic, only to see a human foot and part of a leg slip from it as it sank, a visual that jurors never forgot and that symbolized the depth of betrayal a politically connected lawyer was willing to commit. Anne Marie Fahey deserved better than death at the hands of a man who claimed to love her. Her body was never recovered from the ocean where Capano disposed of it, but the evidence he left behind, the cooler, the blood, the lies, ensured he would never escape accountability. Case 3. Lonnie Kocontes. She believed they were reconciling. Mickey Kanisaki had been married to Lonnie Kocontes, divorced him, but still owned property with him, and had updated her will to name him executor and beneficiary. When he invited her on a Mediterranean cruise in May 2006, she thought it might be a romantic holiday that could lead to remarriage. What she did not know was that he had calculated the value of the joint bank accounts and the Southern California home they still co-owned, determined that her death would net him over $1 million, and chosen a cruise ship specifically because a balcony cabin in international waters seemed like the perfect place to commit murder and disappear a body into the sea. Lonnie Lauren Kocontes was a former Orange County, California attorney who had practiced civil litigation before leaving active practice and eventually moving to Safety Harbor, Florida. By 2006, he was in his early 50s and had been through multiple marriages. Mickey Kanisaki was his second wife, and by the time of the cruise, he had married and divorced a third wife, Amy Nguyen, with whom he remained financially entangled. Public records and court decisions focus on his pattern of financial manipulation and relational deception rather than any documented mental health diagnoses, and there is no record of prior violent crimes, though he would later face charges for allegedly soliciting the murder of another ex-wife while awaiting trial. Financially, he stood to benefit significantly from Mickey's death through their joint accounts and the sale of their home, and investigators would later trace his attempts to move more than $1 million through various accounts immediately after she died. Mickey Kanisaki was 52 years old, a paralegal who had remained in contact with Kocontes after their divorce. Friends described her as intelligent and independent, but emotionally entangled with her ex-husband, vulnerable to the belief that they might rebuild what they had lost. She went on the 2006 Mediterranean cruise, believing reconciliation was possible, unaware that Kocontes viewed her not as a partner, but as an asset to be liquidated. She had no known vulnerabilities other than this emotional history and the shared finances that prosecutors argued Kocontes exploited when he invited her on what she thought was a second chance. In May 2006, Kocontes and Kanazaki flew from California to Spain and boarded a Mediterranean cruise ship sailing from Spain toward Italy. On May 25th, they disembarked in Messina, Italy, for a day trip, then returned to the ship that evening. Kanazaki was last seen alive around 11 that night. Sometime late May 25th, or in the early hours of May 26th, Kocontes strangled Kanazaki in their cabin, likely on or near the bed, and then threw her body over the balcony into the Mediterranean Sea. Around 6 in the morning on May 26th, he reported her missing to crew members, telling them she had vanished and suggesting she might have gone overboard or committed suicide. Later that day, Italian authorities recovered her body floating off Paola, Italy. An autopsy determined the cause of death was asphyxiation by strangulation, not drowning, which meant she had been dead before entering the water, a forensic detail that would become the cornerstone of the prosecution's case years later. The cruise line notified Italian and United States authorities when Kocontes reported his ex-wife missing. The Italian autopsy finding of asphyxiation rather than drowning, combined with the lack of any plausible accidental fall scenario, raised immediate suspicion that Kanazaki had been killed and thrown overboard. Kocontes quickly returned to California and began moving large sums of money between accounts, attempting to consolidate assets tied to Kanazaki's estate. In 2008, the FBI opened a financial crimes investigation when banks reported suspicious transfers totaling over $1 million involving Kocontes. California and federal investigators pieced together financial motives, will changes, and cruise ship evidence, including cabin records and witness statements, building a circumstantial murder case based on motive, opportunity, post-crime behavior, and the forensic pathology from the Italian autopsy that proved she had been strangled before her body hit the water. Kocontes was arrested in 2013 in Florida after an Orange County grand jury indicted him for murder, with the special circumstance of murder for financial gain. His defense initially argued California lacked jurisdiction because the killing occurred in international waters off Italy, leading to one dismissal and refiling as prosecutors adjusted their theory to emphasize acts, including planning and financial transactions, that occurred in California. Ultimately, he was tried in Orange County Superior Court on one count of first-degree murder, with the special circumstance allegation of financial gain murder. Prosecutors did not seek the death penalty, but life without parole. At trial in 2020, the Orange County District Attorney's Office presented evidence that Kocontes had meticulously planned the crime, choosing a ship and balcony cabin ideal for disposing of a body at sea, reconciling with his ex-wife on paper while quietly arranging finances to maximize his inheritance, and strangling her in the secluded confines of their cabin before throwing her overboard. The key forensic evidence was the Italian autopsy showing asphyxiation rather than drowning. If Kanazaki had fallen or jumped alive, her lungs would have contained water, but they did not. A detail prosecutors framed as the mistake that turned an apparent perfect crime into a provable murder. The defense argued lack of direct eyewitnesses and suggested possible suicide or accident, but Kocontes himself conceded on appeal that the evidence was sufficient to support the conviction. A jury took less than an hour to convict him of first-degree murder with the special circumstance financial gain allegation. In September 2020, Kocontes, then 62, was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole in Orange County Superior Court. Orange County District Attorney Todd Spitzer publicly called him a man who almost got away with the perfect crime, emphasizing that strangling Kanazaki before throwing her overboard left vital forensic evidence that ultimately convicted him. Kocontes appealed his conviction, arguing various evidentiary errors and constitutional violations. But in December 2022, The California Court of Appeal affirmed the judgment, finding that while some evidentiary errors occurred, they were harmless and did not prejudice the outcome. Separate from the murder case, he has also faced charges for allegedly soliciting the murder of his third ex-wife while in custody, illustrating an ongoing pattern of lethal manipulation of intimate partners. Kocontes is serving life without parole in California State Prison for the murder of Mickey Kansaki. The case became a cautionary tale about so-called cruise ship murders and jurisdictional gaps in deaths at sea, highlighting how United States prosecutors can assert jurisdiction when planning, financial motives, or other key acts occur in their state, even if the homicide physically happens in international waters. The single most chilling detail is that Kocontes strangled his ex-wife in a luxury cruise cabin, then threw her body into the Mediterranean in the belief that sharks and deep water would erase all evidence, only for her body to float and be recovered with lungs full of air, not water. A lawyer fully aware of evidentiary standards had designed what prosecutors called the perfect crime by exploiting the anonymity and jurisdictional complexity of a cruise ship at sea, then nearly succeeded in escaping accountability for 14 years. Mickey Kansaki believed she was embarking on a romantic reconciliation. She died alone in a cabin with a man who saw her as nothing more than a balance sheet to be liquidated and dumped overboard. Case 4. David Replogle. Clifford Lambert was 74 years old, a retired art dealer and Palm Springs socialite known for his wealth, high-end art collection, and active social life in the Coachella Valley. He lived alone, was openly gay, and was financially comfortable with valuable property, bank accounts, and art assets that made him an attractive target for fraudsters who identified vulnerable, wealthy individuals and exploited them. In late 2008, a group of con artists engineered a fake romantic relationship to gain Lambert's trust, and at the center of that conspiracy was a San Francisco attorney who understood that his law license could transform fraud into what appeared to be legitimate legal transactions, right up until Lambert's body was found buried in the desert and the entire scheme unraveled. David K. Replogle was a San Francisco-based attorney who by 2008 had become involved with a group of con artists targeting wealthy gay men. He was a licensed lawyer, but financially and ethically compromised, willing to use his professional status to facilitate fraud, identity theft, and ultimately murder for personal gain. Public court records do not describe any formal mental health diagnoses or prior violent crime convictions, but his later convictions showed he participated in sophisticated financial schemes and document forgeries designed to strip victims of their life savings and assets. His role in the conspiracy against Clifford Lambert was not as the physical killer, but as the essential legal facilitator who forged powers of attorney, looted bank accounts, and used his status as an attorney to make fraudulent transfers appear credible and lawful. In late 2008, Replogle joined a group including Daniel Garcia, Kushal Narula, Miguel Bustamante, Craig McCarthy, and Russell Manning in a plan to swindle Lambert out of his assets through forged powers of attorney and identity theft. The conspirators used dating and escort services to introduce Lambert to Garcia under false pretenses, creating the illusion of a romantic interest that would give them access to his home, his trust, and eventually his accounts. On December 5, 2008, conspirators lured Lambert to his Palm Springs home, where he was fatally stabbed in his kitchen. His body was later buried in a remote desert location, and for years he was officially only a missing person, while the conspirators moved rapidly to liquidate everything he owned. Prosecutors alleged that Replogle was not present for the stabbing, but had planned the crime and served as the legal architect who prepared or used forged documents to transfer more than $185,000 from Lambert's bank accounts, attempted to sell his house, and moved or tried to liquidate paintings and other valuables, all while using his attorney credentials to make these transfers appear legitimate. Lambert's sudden disappearance around December 2008, combined with suspicious financial activity on his accounts, eventually drew law enforcement attention. Investigators noted that mail and calls went unanswered, while his bank accounts were being rapidly drained by people using newly created powers of attorney and identity documents. Riverside County investigators and Palm Springs police traced financial and property records, uncovering a network of co-conspirators, including Replogle, who had moved to assume control of Lambert's estate and assets. In the following years, authorities located human remains, including a skull and jawbone, in a remote Los Angeles County mountainside that forensic analysis identified as Lambert's, confirming he had been killed rather than voluntarily disappeared. Witness statements, phone records, and paper trails tied the conspirators together, and the Riverside County District Attorney's Office described the scheme as a financially motivated conspiracy, in which Replogle's role was to weaponize his law license to make fraudulent transfers appear credible. Replogle and several co-defendants were arrested and charged with first-degree murder with the special circumstance of murder for financial gain, conspiracy, multiple counts of burglary, grand theft, identity theft, forgery, and related crimes in Riverside County Superior Court. At their first trial in 2011, Replogle and Bustamante were convicted and sentenced to life without parole, but later appeals related to judicial misconduct in the original trial led appellate courts to grant new trials to several defendants, including Replogle. At the 2011 trial, prosecutors had argued that Replogle's intimate involvement in forging powers of attorney, looting bank accounts, and attempting to transfer Lambert's home and art showed clear participation in a murder for financial gain conspiracy, even if he was not physically present at the stabbing. After appellate reversals related to the original judge's conduct, Replogle was retried, and in August 2022, a new jury again convicted him of first-degree murder with special circumstance financial gain, 3 counts of burglary, grand theft, identity theft, attempted receipt of stolen property, and forgery. Key prosecution evidence included Lambert's sudden disappearance, Replogle's forged documents, the rapid draining of accounts, his use of Lambert's identity to try to sell the victim's home, and the eventual discovery and identification of Lambert's remains in a mountain area, confirming homicide. The defense sought to minimize his involvement, portraying him as a lesser participant, but jurors concluded he was an active conspirator whose legal expertise enabled the crime. In July 2025, Riverside County Superior Court Judge Anthony Villalobos sentenced Replogle, then 76, to life in prison without the possibility of parole, plus additional time on white-collar enhancements for Lambert's murder and associated financial crimes. This was effectively a reimposition of his original life without parole sentence after the retrial. Replogle's initial conviction and life sentence had been overturned for procedural reasons, not due to any exonerating evidence, and his subsequent 2022 conviction and 2025 life without parole sentence followed a second full trial. As of the latest reporting, he remains convicted, and any further appeals will likely challenge trial procedure, but face the weight of 2 separate jury verdicts. Replogle is serving life without the possibility of parole in a California state prison following his 2025 resentencing. The Riverside County District Attorney's Office has publicly emphasized his central role as the lawyer who weaponized legal documents against his victim. The Lambert case drew national attention as an example of elder financial exploitation and targeted violence in the LGBTQ community, with a wealthy older gay man groomed and then killed for his assets. Perhaps the most shocking aspect is the cold, transactional view of Lambert as nothing more than a ledger of assets to be stripped after his disappearance. Conspirators immediately used forged documents to assume his identity and loot his life's work. Clifford Lambert was a man who had built a career in art, cultivated a social life in Palm Springs, and deserved to live out his years in the community he loved. Instead, he was stabbed to death in his own kitchen, buried in a remote mountain area, and nearly erased from existence by people who believed a desert burial would forever conceal both the man and the crime. It took years for forensic science and persistent detectives to piece the case together and bring his killers to justice. Case 5. Andrew Rocker. The divorce papers were filed on February 25, 1994. Sharon Rocker had decided to end her marriage to Andrew after years together, seeking legal separation and a new life independent of the man who held one of the most powerful legal positions in Cambridge, Ohio. 4 days later, on March 1st, Andrew Rocker shot her 5 times in the head and chest at point-blank range with a .22 caliber handgun, killing her in their Guernsey County home. The city law director, the chief legal officer sworn to uphold the law in his community, had become a murderer within days of his wife asserting her right to leave. Andrew Joseph Rocker Jr. was the law director for Cambridge, Ohio, and a licensed attorney when he murdered his wife in 1994. As city law director and a local prosecutor, he held a position of public trust and wielded substantial influence in local legal affairs, advising the city on legal matters and handling prosecutions. Sharon Rocker was 44 years old, married to Andrew for many years, and the mother of their children. On February 25, 1994, she filed for divorce, indicating severe marital strain and a determination to end the relationship. Public disciplinary records and appellate decisions do not describe prior violent crime convictions or formal mental health diagnoses for Andrew, though his later filings alleged various grievances about his trial and representation. The divorce filing, prosecutors argued, triggered a lethal response from a man who could not tolerate the loss of control and the public humiliation of his marriage ending. On March 1st, 1994, just days after Sharon filed for divorce, Andrew shot her 5 times in the head and chest at point-blank range with a .22 caliber handgun, killing her at or near the family home in rural Guernsey County. Local law enforcement and emergency responders were called to the scene, where Sharon was found fatally shot. Given that the killing occurred in the marital home and involved a known firearm, and that Andrew was present and closely connected, he was quickly identified as the prime suspect. A Guernsey County grand jury indicted him on March 25, 1994, on 1 count of aggravated murder with a firearm specification under Ohio law, alleging prior calculation and design, Ohio's equivalent to premeditated first-degree murder. The obvious motive was rage and control linked to the divorce filing, with evidence suggesting he could not tolerate the loss of his marriage and status. A jury trial began September 12, 1994, in Guernsey County Court of Common Pleas. The prosecution presented evidence that Andrew had intentionally shot Sharon 5 times at close range in the head and chest with a .22 caliber handgun, emphasizing the divorce filing days earlier as motive and the multiple shots as proof of purposeful killing. The defense attempted to challenge elements of premeditation and raise various procedural issues, and in subsequent appeals, Andrew argued about pretrial publicity, jury impartiality, evidentiary rulings, and claimed incompetency. But the trial court and appellate courts rejected these contentions. The jury convicted him of aggravated murder with the firearm specification. On October 28, 1994, the trial court sentenced Andrew Rocker to life imprisonment with parole eligibility after 20 years, plus an additional mandatory 3-year term for the firearm specification to be served consecutively under then-current Ohio law. His conviction was affirmed on direct appeal by the 5th District Court of Appeals in 1996, and the Ohio Supreme Court declined further review. He then filed a post-conviction relief petition alleging ineffective assistance of counsel, juror bias, prosecutorial misconduct, and other constitutional violations, which the trial court denied, and the appellate court also rejected in a detailed 1998 opinion, finding no substantive grounds for relief. Separately, the Ohio Supreme Court's disciplinary board recommended, and the court ordered, that Rocker be permanently disbarred due to his aggravated murder conviction, noting that permanent disbarment is the only appropriate sanction when an attorney is convicted of murder. Andrew Rocker remains incarcerated in Ohio, serving a life sentence with parole eligibility after 20 years plus 3 years for the gun specification. Given the gravity of the crime and his disbarment, there is no indication he has been released. Within Ohio's legal community, the case is often cited in disciplinary opinions as an example that a lawyer convicted of murder will automatically be permanently disbarred. The rapid escalation from divorce filing to homicide remains the most disturbing facet of the case. Within 4 days of Sharon's petition to end the marriage, the city law director shot her 5 times at close range. The betrayal of public trust is profound. The community's chief legal officer became a convicted murderer, and the woman who sought legal protection through divorce was killed by the man who was supposed to embody the law. Sharon Rocker deserved the freedom to leave a marriage that had become untenable. She filed the paperwork, followed the legal process, and was murdered for it by someone who understood the law better than almost anyone and chose to violate it in the most irreversible way possible. Case 6. Richard Merritt. He had already stolen from his clients, elderly, vulnerable people who trusted him to settle their injury cases, and instead found their money disappearing into his accounts. Richard Merritt had been disbarred in January 2018, convicted on 34 felony counts in 2019, and sentenced to 30 years, with 15 to serve in prison and 15 on probation. On February 1st, 2019, he was supposed to report to the Cobb County Jail by 5 in the afternoon to begin serving his sentence. Instead, he spent that day at his mother's home in Stone Mountain, and when relatives arrived the next morning, they found 77-year-old Shirley Merritt dead at the bottom of the basement stairs, her body covered in blood from brutal blunt force injuries and multiple stab wounds. Her son, the disgraced attorney, had fled in her silver Lexus SUV, cutting off his court-ordered ankle monitor and disappearing. It would take 8 months to find him. Richard Merritt was a Smyrna, Georgia personal injury attorney who by the late 2000s had built a substantial practice but was secretly stealing from clients, particularly elderly and vulnerable ones. Admitted to practice around 2000, he ran Merritt and Fletcher, LLC, and later a solo firm before being disbarred in January 2018, after admitting to misappropriating client funds. In 2019, he faced 34 felony counts in Cobb County for theft, forgery, and elder exploitation, having settled cases without clients' knowledge, forged their signatures on checks and releases, and kept more than $450,000 for himself. He was married, later divorced, and had children, and family members later described a history of ego and deceit, though public court records do not reference a diagnosed mental health disorder. Financially, he was in crisis by early 2019, facing restitution orders of roughly $450,000 and a 30-year sentence, with 15 years to serve in prison and 15 on probation for his financial crimes. Shirley Merritt was 77 years old, a retired woman living in Stone Mountain, DeKalb County, Georgia, who had long supported her son emotionally and financially, even as his legal career collapsed. He was living in her home at the time of the murder, and she had reportedly been preparing a final home-cooked meal for him before he was to report to prison on his Cobb County sentence, symbolizing her ongoing support despite his crimes. Family described her as generous and trusting, traits Richard exploited repeatedly. On January 18th, 2019, Richard pleaded guilty in Cobb County to his theft and elder abuse counts and was sentenced to 30 years with 15 in prison and 15 on probation, ordered to wear an ankle monitor, and told to turn himself in at the Cobb County Jail by 5 in the afternoon on February 1st, 2019. On February 1st, Richard was at his mother's Stone Mountain home. A relative planned to drive up that day to support Shirley and take Richard to jail, but received a text message purportedly from Shirley telling him not to come and saying she and Richard had matters to handle and that she would drive him to the jail herself. Prosecutors later argued this text was part of Richard's manipulation and that Shirley never actually sent it. During the day on February 1st, Richard brutally beat and stabbed his mother to death inside her home using a heavy dumbbell and a knife. She suffered devastating blunt force injuries and multiple stab wounds. His ankle monitor showed he was at the house from approximately 9:38 in the morning until 2:30 in the afternoon when he left, drove past the Cobb County Jail on the interstate without stopping, and ultimately cut off the ankle monitor around 4:12 in the afternoon north of Atlanta. He stole her silver Lexus SUV and fled the state, leaving his own vehicle at the murder scene. On February 2nd, 2019, Shirley's body was discovered in her Stone Mountain home by a relative who had come anyway out of concern. She was found at the bottom of basement stairs, covered in blood from extensive blunt force and stab wounds. Investigators quickly noted that Richard had failed to report to prison the previous day, that his ankle monitor had been cut off and discarded after a trip north past the jail, and that his car was at the scene while his mother's Lexus was missing. The United States Marshal Service launched a nationwide manhunt, warning that Richard was considered dangerous. 8 months later, in September 2019, marshals and local police located him in Nashville, Tennessee, where he had been living under an alias, working at a secondhand store, and dating a woman he met online under a fake name. He was arrested without incident and extradited back to Georgia. DeKalb County authorities charged Richard with malice murder, felony murder, aggravated assault, and possession of a knife during the commission of a felony. He initially pleaded not guilty and remained incarcerated awaiting trial, while his Cobb County 30-year sentence for financial crimes was converted so that all 30 years would be served in prison due to his escape and new alleged offense. The murder trial took place in 2023 in DeKalb County Superior Court before Judge Courtney Johnson. Prosecutors presented evidence of the brutal nature of the attack, the timing relative to his required prison report date, his GPS ankle monitor data, the suspicious text to a relative, his flight in his mother's car, and his months on the run living under an alias in Tennessee. The prosecution argued that Richard killed Shirley because she opposed his plan to flee instead of reporting to prison, and that he could not bear the humiliation of incarceration, choosing matricide and escape instead. They stressed the ferocity of the beating and stabbing as evidence of malice. Richard testified in his own defense, spinning a story that 2 unknown armed men had invaded the home, killed his mother with a dumbbell and knife, and forced him to leave. He claimed he fled out of fear, but never reported the supposed attackers. The jury rejected this account as implausible. After less than an hour of deliberation on May 24th, 2023, the jury found Richard guilty on all counts. Judge Courtney Johnson sentenced Richard to life in prison without the possibility of parole for malice murder, plus 5 additional years for the weapons charge to be served consecutively. She noted his history of defrauding vulnerable clients, his betrayal of family, and his lack of genuine remorse despite a brief, vague apology. During sentencing, a cousin delivered a powerful victim impact statement describing Richard as egotistical and evil, recounting his thefts, flight, and the emotional devastation of Shirley's murder. Richard reacted angrily in court at one point, undercutting his claims of contrition. He sought a new trial, arguing ineffective assistance of counsel and various trial errors, but those efforts have not overturned his conviction. Richard Merritt is serving life without the possibility of parole in a Georgia state prison for the murder of his mother. The case stands as one of the most shocking examples of betrayal in recent Georgia legal history. A disbarred attorney who had stolen from elderly clients, including forging their signatures and keeping settlement money meant for vulnerable people, killed the one person who had continued to support him even after his crimes were exposed. Shirley Merritt had prepared a meal for her son, planned to drive him to prison herself, and believed in him despite everything he had done. He repaid that loyalty by beating and stabbing her to death in her own home, stealing her car, and fleeing to another state to live under a fake identity. The image of a mother making a final home-cooked meal for a son about to begin a prison sentence, only to be murdered by that same son hours before he was due to report, captures a level of depravity and selfishness that defies comprehension. Shirley Merritt deserved to live out her remaining years in peace, free from the chaos her son had created. Instead, she became his final victim. Case 7. Carlos Perez-Olivo. They were driving home from dinner on a November night in 2006, traveling along a dark stretch of the Sawmill River Parkway in Westchester County, New York, when Carlos Perez-Olivo told investigators that another vehicle forced them off the road and a man got into their car, demanded money, and shot both of them before fleeing. Carlos survived a superficial wound to the abdomen. His wife, Peggy, was shot in the head and died weeks later without regaining consciousness. For months, the story held a random highway robbery gone tragically wrong. Then investigators began looking more closely at the life Carlos had been living, the financial desperation he faced, and the $2 million life insurance policy on Peggy's life, and the narrative of the random attacker unraveled completely. Carlos Perez-Olivo was a criminal defense attorney in New York who had built a successful practice before his career began deteriorating in the mid-2000s. By 2006, he was in his 50s, married to Peggy Perez-Olivo, and facing severe financial problems, including mounting debts, a stalled legal career, and expenses he could no longer cover. He had been disbarred earlier that year for mishandling client funds, and the loss of his law license meant the loss of income that had sustained their upper-middle-class lifestyle. Public records do not indicate prior violent crime convictions or mental health diagnoses, but financial desperation became the clear motive when investigators examined the circumstances surrounding Peggy's death. Carlos had taken out a $2 million life insurance policy on Peggy's life, and by the fall of 2006, that policy represented the only way he could see to resolve the financial crisis threatening to destroy everything he had built. Peggy Perez-Olivo was in her 50s, a wife and mother who had stood by Carlos through the ups and downs of his legal career and believed in the life they had created together. She worked and contributed to the household, and friends described her as devoted to her family and unaware of the full extent of the financial collapse Carlos had been concealing from her. On the night of November 18th, 2006, she was simply returning home from dinner with her husband, riding in the passenger seat of their SUV, trusting the man beside her. She had no reason to believe that the evening would end with a bullet in her head, or that the random attacker Carlos would describe to police was a fiction designed to cover the fact that he had shot her himself. On November 18th, 2006, Carlos and Peggy left a restaurant and were driving north on the Sawmill River Parkway in Westchester County when Carlos later claimed that another vehicle forced them off the road near the town of Millwood. According to his account, a man approached their stopped SUV, got into the back seat, demanded money and wallets, and when Carlos resisted, the man shot Peggy in the head and shot Carlos in the abdomen before fleeing. Carlos managed to drive a short distance before calling for help. Peggy was rushed to the hospital in critical condition with a gunshot wound to the head. She remained in a coma for weeks before dying on December 1st, 2006, without ever regaining consciousness. Carlos survived his injury, which investigators later determined was a superficial, through-and-through wound that missed all vital organs and caused minimal internal damage. Investigators from the Westchester County District Attorney's Office and New York State Police initially treated the case as a robbery and shooting, but inconsistencies in Carlos's account quickly raised suspicions. Forensic analysis of the crime scene showed that the bullet that struck Peggy had been fired from inside the vehicle, not by someone sitting in the back seat, as Carlos described. Ballistics experts determined the angle and trajectory were inconsistent with his version of events. Additionally, the gun used in the shooting, a pistol Carlos claimed the attacker had brought, was later found in a nearby lake. An investigation revealed it had been reported stolen months earlier from a home where Carlos had done legal work. Financial records showed that Carlos was hundreds of thousands of dollars in debt, had been disbarred, and stood to collect $2 million from Peggy's life insurance. Investigators also discovered that in the weeks before the shooting, Carlos had been researching the Sawmill River Parkway and had made suspicious purchases. Witnesses reported seeing no other vehicle force them off the road that night, and Carlos's wound appeared to be self-inflicted based on its location and superficiality. Carlos was arrested and charged with second-degree murder in Peggy's death. He pleaded not guilty and maintained throughout that a stranger had attacked them. His trial took place in 2008 in Westchester County Court, and prosecutors presented the forensic evidence showing the shot that killed Peggy came from inside the car, the financial motive of the $2 million insurance policy, the planted gun recovered from the lake that had been stolen from a client's home, and the implausibility of Carlos's account of a random highway robbery. The defense argued that the evidence was circumstantial and that Carlos had no history of violence, but the prosecution countered that financial desperation had driven him to murder his wife and stage an elaborate cover story. The jury deliberated and found Carlos guilty of second-degree murder. In 2008, Carlos Perez-Olivo was sentenced to 25 years to life in prison for the murder of Peggy Perez-Olivo. He has pursued appeals challenging the sufficiency of evidence and various trial rulings, but his conviction has been upheld. He remains incarcerated in New York State Prison, continuing to maintain his innocence and insisting that an unknown attacker killed his wife. Carlos Perez-Olivo is serving 25 years to life in a New York State prison for Peggy's murder. The case became a prominent example of staged crime scenes and financial motive homicides, featured on multiple true crime television programs, and discussed in legal circles as a case study in circumstantial evidence and forensic reconstruction. Peggy Perez-Olivo trusted her husband completely and had no reason to fear the man driving beside her on a dark parkway that November night. She believed they were simply going home from dinner. Instead, Carlos shot her in the head, shot himself superficially to support his fabricated story, and called for help only after ensuring she could not survive to contradict his account. She spent weeks in a coma before dying, never knowing that the random attacker her husband described to police was a fiction, and that the person who had destroyed her life was the man she had stood beside for decades. Financial desperation does not justify murder, and the $2 million Carlos hoped to collect from her death became instead the motive that convicted him and ensured he would spend the rest of his life in prison. Case 8. Fred Tokars. The children were in the back seat. On November 29, 1992, Sarah Tokars was driving home to suburban Atlanta with her 2 young sons, ages 4 and 6, after a trip to Florida when a man appeared in the driveway of their Marietta home, forced his way into the car, and shot Sarah in the head at point-blank range while her children sat behind her. The boys survived physically unharmed but traumatized beyond measure, and the gunman fled. For a brief time, the murder appeared to be a random carjacking gone horrific. Then investigators began examining the life of Sarah's husband, Frederick Tokars, a prominent Atlanta attorney and former prosecutor, and what they discovered was a conspiracy so depraved that it remains one of Georgia's most shocking cases. A man who had hired someone to murder his wife in front of their children to prevent her from exposing his criminal enterprises. Frederick W. Tokars, known as Fred, was an Atlanta attorney who had served as an assistant district attorney in Fulton County before entering private practice and becoming involved in various business ventures. By the early 1990s, he was in his late 30s or early 40s, married to Sarah Tokars, and presenting the image of a successful lawyer and family man. What Sarah and others did not know was that Fred had become deeply involved in drug money laundering, operating a nightclub that served as a front for illegal activities, and cultivating relationships with criminals who owed him favors and feared his connections. He had no prior violent crime convictions, but investigators would later determine he had been engaged in serious financial crimes for years, using his legal expertise to conceal the flow of drug money through his business operations. By late 1992, Sarah had discovered evidence of Fred's illegal activities and was preparing to divorce him and potentially cooperate with authorities, a threat Fred could not tolerate. Sarah Tokars was in her late 30s, a wife and mother of 2 young boys who had believed in the life she and Fred had built together. She worked, managed the household, and devoted herself to raising their sons. In the months before her death, she had begun finding financial records and documents that revealed Fred's involvement in criminal enterprises, and she had confided in friends and family that she was planning to leave him and take the children. She had no idea that her husband was already planning to have her killed, viewing her not as the mother of his children, but as a witness who needed to be eliminated before she could destroy the life he had constructed. On November 29, 1992, she was simply driving her sons home from a Thanksgiving trip to Florida, looking forward to getting the boys to bed after a long drive. On the evening of November 29, 1992, Sarah pulled into the driveway of the family's home in the East Cobb area of Marietta, Georgia. A man emerged from the shadows, forced his way into the car, and shot Sarah once in the head at point-blank range while her 2 young sons sat in the back seat. The gunman fled, and the children, unharmed physically, but witnessing their mother's murder, were left alone in the car with her body. Neighbors heard the commotion and called for help. Sarah was pronounced dead at the scene. The initial investigation treated the case as a possible carjacking or robbery, but detectives quickly became suspicious when they learned about Fred's background, his financial situation, and the timing of Sarah's plans to leave him. Investigators discovered that Fred had orchestrated Sarah's murder by hiring Curtis Rower, a man with criminal connections, to kill her. Fred had paid Rower and provided detailed information about Sarah's travel plans, the route she would take home from Florida, and the layout of their home. Fred had deliberately stayed behind in Florida with an alibi, ensuring he was far from the scene when the murder occurred. Detectives also uncovered Fred's involvement in drug money laundering operations and his connections to organized crime figures. Wiretaps, financial records, and witness testimony from co-conspirators revealed the scope of Fred's criminal activities and his calculated decision to have Sarah killed rather than risk exposure. Rower was arrested and agreed to cooperate with authorities, providing detailed testimony about Fred's role in planning and paying for the murder. Fred Tokars was arrested and charged with malice murder, conspiracy, and racketeering related to Sarah's death and his criminal enterprises. Curtis Rower and other co-conspirators were also charged. Fred pleaded not guilty and maintained he had nothing to do with Sarah's death, but the evidence against him was overwhelming. At trial, prosecutors presented Rower's testimony, financial records showing payments to the hitman, wiretap evidence, and testimony from witnesses who described Fred's criminal activities and his fear that Sarah would expose him. The defense attempted to discredit Rower as a career criminal seeking leniency, but the prosecution's case included corroborating evidence that left little doubt about Fred's guilt. A jury convicted Fred Tokars of malice murder and conspiracy. Fred Tokars was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole for Sarah's murder. Curtis Rower received a life sentence for his role as the triggerman. Fred pursued appeals for years, challenging various aspects of his conviction and trial, but appellate courts consistently upheld the verdict. He remained incarcerated in Georgia State Prison, and as of the most recent reporting, he died in prison of natural causes, though the exact date of death varies in public records. The Tokars case became one of Atlanta's most notorious murders, the subject of books and television programs, and a powerful example of how a lawyer's knowledge of the criminal justice system can be weaponized for evil. Fred Tokars used his legal training, his connections, and his understanding of how to cover his tracks to orchestrate the murder of his wife in front of their children, calculating that he could eliminate the threat she posed while maintaining an alibi and his public reputation. Sarah Tokars was murdered in her own driveway in front of her 2 small sons by a man her husband had hired and directed. Those children witnessed their mother's death and lost their father to prison, their entire family destroyed by one man's greed and depravity. Sarah deserved to raise her sons, to leave a marriage that had become dangerous, and to live free from the threat of violence. Instead, she was executed in a plot designed by the person who should have protected her, and her children carried the trauma of that night for the rest of their lives. Case 9. Paul Berggren. The witness was preparing to testify. Kimo Deshawn McCrae was a key government witness in a federal drug conspiracy case, and his testimony threatened to send multiple defendants to prison for decades. Paul Berggren, a high-profile criminal defense attorney in Newark, New Jersey, had represented some of those defendants and understood exactly what McCrae's testimony would mean. On April 27, 2004, McCrae was shot to death in the street in Newark, gunned down before he could ever take the stand. For years, the murder appeared to be retaliation by drug dealers trying to silence a snitch. Then federal investigators began building a case that Paul Berggren himself had ordered the hit, using his position as a lawyer to orchestrate witness intimidation and murder, running a criminal enterprise while wearing a suit, and carrying a briefcase into courtrooms across New Jersey. Paul W. Berggren was a former federal prosecutor in New Jersey who had left the United States Attorney's Office to enter private criminal defense practice in Newark, where he built a reputation as an aggressive, high-profile attorney, representing drug dealers, organized crime figures, and other serious felony defendants. By the early 2000s, he was in his 40s or 50s, well known in legal circles, and commanding substantial fees from clients who valued his willingness to fight aggressively and his connections within the criminal underworld. Public records do not describe prior violent crime convictions or mental health diagnoses before his arrest, but federal prosecutors would later argue that Berggren had crossed the line from zealous advocacy into active participation in criminal conspiracies, including drug trafficking, prostitution, and murder for hire. He had no apparent financial desperation. His practice was lucrative, but investigators believed he had become so enmeshed with his criminal clients that he functioned as a member of their enterprises rather than merely their legal representative. Kimo Deshawn McCrae was a young man involved in the Newark drug trade who had agreed to cooperate with federal authorities and testify in a drug conspiracy prosecution. His cooperation threatened multiple defendants, including clients Berggren had represented or had connections to, and his testimony could result in lengthy federal sentences. McCrae was not just a witness, he was a threat to the criminal networks Berggren had allegedly become part of. On April 27, 2004, McCrae was shot to death on the streets of Newark, killed in what initially appeared to be typical street violence or gang retaliation. He was in his 20s, and his death meant that his testimony was lost, and the prosecution's case against the defendants he would have testified against was weakened. Federal investigators did not initially connect his murder to Berggren, but over the following years, evidence accumulated that the lawyer had played a central role in orchestrating McCrae's killing. Federal authorities, including the FBI and the United States Attorney's Office for the District of New Jersey, began investigating Berggren in connection with a wide range of criminal activities, including drug trafficking conspiracies, operating a prostitution business, witness tampering, and murder for hire. Wiretaps, informant testimony, and financial records revealed that Berggren was not simply defending criminals, but actively participating in their operations, laundering money, arranging drug deals, and using violence or threats of violence to protect his interests and those of his clients. The investigation into McCrae's murder developed slowly, But eventually, cooperating witnesses came forward to testify that Berggren had ordered the hit, directing associates to kill McRae before he could testify. Prosecutors alleged that Berggren had explicitly told associates, "No chemo, no case," meaning that if McRae was dead, the prosecution's case would collapse. Witnesses described Berggren as operating a racketeering enterprise under the cover of his law practice, using his legal knowledge to evade detection while directing criminal activities, ranging from drug distribution to contract killings. Berggren was arrested and charged in federal court with racketeering, conspiracy to commit murder, witness tampering, drug trafficking, operating a prostitution business, and multiple other counts. He pleaded not guilty and mounted an aggressive defense, arguing that he was being persecuted for providing zealous representation to unpopular clients and that the government's witnesses were career criminals seeking leniency in exchange for fabricated testimony. His first trial in 2011 ended in a mistrial after the jury deadlocked on most counts, though he was convicted on some lesser charges. Federal prosecutors retried him, and at the second trial in 2013, the government presented an extensive case including wiretap recordings, testimony from multiple cooperating witnesses, financial records, and evidence linking Berggren to the murder of Kimo McRae and other violent acts. The defense again attacked the credibility of government witnesses, but the second jury found the evidence overwhelming. In 2013, Paul Berggren was convicted on all counts, including racketeering, conspiracy to commit murder in the deaths of Kimo McRae and another individual, witness tampering, and drug trafficking. In 2013, United States District Judge Dennis Kavanaugh sentenced Paul Berggren to life in prison plus 30 years for his racketeering convictions, murder conspiracies, and related crimes. The sentence was effectively life, without the possibility of parole, given Berggren's age and the length of the term. Judge Kavanaugh described Berggren as a lawyer who had betrayed his oath and used his legal skills to operate a criminal enterprise responsible for violence, drug distribution, and the corruption of the justice system. Berggren has pursued appeals, challenging the sufficiency of evidence, the credibility of government witnesses, and various trial rulings, but his convictions have been largely upheld by appellate courts. He remains incarcerated in federal prison. Paul Berggren is serving life in federal prison for racketeering, murder conspiracy, and related crimes. The case became one of the most notorious examples of attorney corruption in recent New Jersey history, illustrating how a lawyer's knowledge of the criminal justice system and connections to criminal clients can be weaponized to obstruct justice and commit violent crimes. Kimo Deshaun McRae was preparing to testify and cooperate with federal authorities when he was gunned down on a Newark street. His life ended by a conspiracy that prosecutors argued was orchestrated by the very lawyer who understood how devastating his testimony would be. McRae deserved the protection the government promised him as a cooperating witness. Instead, he was murdered in a plot directed by someone who wore a suit, carried a law degree, and operated with the sophistication to evade detection for years. Paul Berggren's fall from federal prosecutor to convicted racketeer and murderer stands as a cautionary tale about how power, access, and legal knowledge can corrupt absolutely when separated from any sense of ethics or accountability. Case 10. Donnie Rudd. She died on September 13th, 1973, on a rural road outside Barrington, Illinois, when the car her husband was driving went off the roadway and struck a utility pole. Noreen Cometa Rudd was 23 years old, newly married to Donnie Rudd, and her death was ruled accidental after her husband told investigators that she had been driving, lost control, and crashed. Donnie collected on her life insurance, remarried within months, and moved on with his life. 42 years later, investigators reopened the case and determined that Noreen had been murdered, struck in the head with a blunt object before the staged car crash, and that the man she had married just weeks earlier had killed her for the insurance money and then spent 4 decades living freely while her family grieved an accident that had never happened. Donnie Rudd was in his 20s in 1973, a law student at John Marshall Law School in Chicago, who was working toward becoming an attorney while presenting himself as a clean-cut, ambitious young man with a bright future. He had met Lonnie Kocontes, a young woman from the Chicago area, and after a brief courtship, they married in August 1973. Public records do not describe prior violent crime convictions before Noreen's death, though investigators would later discover a pattern of deception and manipulation in his relationships. After Noreen's death, Donnie completed law school, passed the bar, practiced law in Illinois and later in Texas, and built a career that spanned decades. He remarried multiple times, and in at least one later marriage, he was accused of domestic violence, though those charges were not directly connected to Noreen's case. By the 2000s, when investigators began re-examining Noreen's death, Donnie was in his 60s, living in Texas, and had spent over 40 years believing he had gotten away with murder. Lonnie Kocontes was 23 years old in September 1973, newly married to Donnie after a whirlwind courtship, and looking forward to building a life with the man she believed loved her. She worked and supported Donnie while he attended law school, and friends and family described her as kind, trusting, and devoted. She had no idea that Donnie had taken out a life insurance policy on her life shortly after their marriage, or that he viewed her not as a partner, but as a financial asset to be liquidated. On September 13th, 1973, less than a month after their wedding, she was riding in a car with Donnie on a rural road near Barrington, Illinois, when she was struck in the head with a blunt object, likely a tire iron or similar tool, and rendered unconscious or dead. Donnie then staged a car crash to make it appear she had been driving and lost control, and he told investigators that she had been behind the wheel when the accident occurred. Barrington area police and investigators responded to the crash scene on September 13th, 1973, and found Noreen dead from what appeared to be injuries sustained in a single vehicle accident. Donnie, who had survived with minor injuries, told authorities that Noreen had been driving, lost control, and struck a utility pole, and that he had tried to save her but could not. An autopsy at the time noted head injuries, but in the context of a car crash, those injuries were attributed to the collision, and her death was ruled accidental. Donnie collected on the life insurance policy, and within months had remarried and moved on. The case remained closed for over 4 decades. In 2013, Barrington Police, working with the Cook County State's Attorney's Office Cold Case Unit, reopened the investigation into Noreen's death after reviewing old case files and identifying inconsistencies in Donnie's account and the physical evidence. Investigators re-interviewed witnesses, re-examined autopsy reports and crash scene evidence, and consulted with forensic experts who determined that Noreen's head injuries were inconsistent with a car crash and instead consistent with being struck by a blunt object before the vehicle left the road. Tire marks and damage to the car suggested it had been deliberately driven off the road to stage an accident. Investigators also discovered that Donnie had taken out a life insurance policy on Noreen shortly after their marriage, establishing financial motive. In 2015, more than 40 years after Noreen's death, Donnie Rudd was arrested in Texas and charged with first-degree murder in Cook County, Illinois. He was extradited to Illinois, where he pleaded not guilty and maintained that Noreen's death had been a tragic accident. At trial in 2018, prosecutors presented forensic evidence showing that Noreen's head injuries could not have been caused by the car crash and were instead the result of being struck with a blunt object. They presented evidence of the insurance policy Donnie had taken out shortly after marriage, the suspicious timing of her death, and inconsistencies in his account of the crash. Crash reconstruction experts testified that the damage to the vehicle and the scene evidence were consistent with a staged accident. The defense argued that the evidence was circumstantial and that advances in forensic science were being used to reinterpret an old case. But the prosecution countered that the evidence had always pointed to murder, and that investigators in 1973 had simply accepted Donnie's story without sufficient scrutiny. A Cook County jury deliberated and found Donnie Rudd guilty of first-degree murder. In 2018, Donnie Rudd was sentenced to 75 years in prison for the murder of Lonnie Kocontes Rudd. Given his age at sentencing, he was in his late 60s. The sentence was effectively life in prison. Noreen's family members, who had waited over 4 decades for justice, addressed the court and described the pain of losing her, and the years of believing her death was an accident, only to learn she had been murdered by the man she trusted. Donnie showed no remorse and continued to maintain his innocence. He has pursued appeals challenging the conviction, but as of the latest reporting, his conviction has been upheld. Donnie Rudd is serving 75 years in an Illinois state prison for Noreen's murder. The case became a powerful example of cold case persistence and advances in forensic science, allowing investigators to solve decades-old crimes that were originally misclassified. Lonnie Kocontes married Donnie Rudd in August 1973, believing she had found a partner for life. Less than a month later, he struck her in the head, staged a car crash to make it appear accidental, and collected insurance money while her family grieved what they believed was a tragic accident. For 42 years, Donnie lived freely, practiced law, remarried, and built a life on the foundation of a murder he believed would never be discovered. Noreen's family deserved the truth from the beginning, and Noreen deserved to live the life she had just begun. Instead, she was killed by a man who saw her as nothing more than an insurance payout, and justice took over 4 decades to arrive. The 75-year sentence ensures that Donnie Rudd will spend the rest of his life in prison, finally held accountable for a crime he committed when Richard Nixon was still president and thought he had buried forever on a rural Illinois road.